From the Dominion Post, in Morgantown, West Virginia, this is the Postcast, the audio companion to the Dominion Post newspaper. In this episode, Morgantown mourns the passing of a local advocate, outdoor enthusiasts get some good news from the Senate, and a conversation with a local Black Lives Matter activist. I'm your host, Chris Schultz, and these are the week's top stories. Morgantown lost one of its leading lights on Sunday. Betty Pushkar died at her home in Morgantown at the age of 80 after months of declining health. Her death is not related to COVID-19. I'm joined now by Dominion Post reporter Jim Bissett. Jim, Morgantown's community is mourning the loss of a really impactful and important member. For those that didn't know her, can you explain to us who Betty Pushkar was?
Yeah, Chris, thanks for having me. Betty Pushkar I think she was really the face of cancer awareness in West Virginia. We're not the healthiest state in the union. We have a high prevalence of breast cancer rates, ovarian cancer. Cancer casts a pretty big shadow over West Virginia. Betty, she was synonymous with cancer research and treatment in West Virginia. For those people who don't know, that's her name on the Betty Pushkar Breast Care Center and on the Evansdale campus at WVU.
So, yeah, obviously, as you say, she has her family, not just her, have this very important position in Morgantown's modern history. Why does that center carry her name?
Well, it carries her name because she, like countless numbers of women, one day she found a lump, and that changed everything. It was Halloween 1985. She's getting ready. I think they were getting ready to have a costume party. Her former husband was Mike Pushkar, who co-founded Milan Pharmaceuticals in Morgantown, and whose name is Milan Pushkar Stadium at Mountaineer Field. They're getting ready to go to a party, and she finds this lump, and she goes to get it checked out. And like a lot of women, the doctor comes in, and the doctor has the x-rays and the charts, and the doctor tells her that it's advanced cancer, and she's got maybe 1 to 3 years to live.
And where did she go from there?
West Virginia didn't have the resources. There weren't any standalone cancer clinics in West Virginia at the time. They were privileged. They could afford to go beyond the borders. So she got on an airplane and went to the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas, which at the time was probably the top cancer treatment facility in the country. And she goes down there, undergoes a highly aggressive experimental form of treatment. It took a toll on her, but she got through it. And at one point, she was getting on planes, she was going back and forth. She got too sick to fly, to do anything, so she was bedridden for months. And again, because they had the resources, they chartered an airplane. MD Anderson would fly the chemotherapy drugs that she needed. They would fly them into Hart Field in Morgantown. And she started thinking, she was a kid who grew up in rural Virginia, about 20 minutes from West Virginia. She grew up in a house with 6 brothers and sisters and no running water. And her dad made $25 a week. That was his take-home pay from a textile mill down there. And she started thinking, how many people from where I'm from in Snake Hill, Virginia, how many people could even begin to afford this treatment? And more importantly, because she's in Morgantown now, how many women in West Virginia could afford this treatment? So she started thinking that she wanted to have a cancer center established in West Virginia. Women here could have that same level of care that she had with all of her resources.
And how did Betty Pushkar go about achieving that goal of bringing top-quality cancer treatment to West Virginia?
Well, her husband at the time, Mike Pushkar, was known for his altruism just as much as his business acumen. Because people knew him, they knew her too, and she was of the same cloth of her husband. She wanted to reach out too because he was a working class kid from Youngstown, Ohio, the son of Serbian immigrants. She was a kid who grew up pretty poor in Virginia. And so the idea was to share the wealth. So she banked on her name, her Pushkar name, started lobbying at the same time that the WVU medical community started saying, well, we're the state's land-grant university. We're turning Morgantown into a medical hub. It's kind of our obligation, our responsibility to make these medical resources available. So it all came together, with Betty definitely being a key player in the project. And 5 years after her cancer diagnosis, where she was told she had 1 to 3 years to live, 5 years later, you've got a cancer center at WVU on the Evansdale campus. And within that cancer center, you have the Betty Pushkar Breast Care Center. Betty, when she was bedridden in Morgantown, she started envisioning this cancer center in her mind. She started building it in her mind. It was pretty bad where she just felt, I can't even get out of bed. I can't even move. She would still put her imagination to work building that cancer center in her mind. It was like therapy for her. That's what she did.
Jim, in your role as Dominion Post reporter, having worked in this community for many, many years now, you actually had a few opportunities to meet Betty Pushkar in person. What kind of an impression did she give you when you met her?
Well, she was always very gracious, very approachable. People would go up to her, and she would light up when she would talk to people, and there was always like a little hug, or she would always there'd be like a little tap on the forearm. She's just very friendly, very, very approachable. Had a sense of humor, too, that a lot of people didn't always see.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for being on the show today and helping us remember such an important person in not only Morgantown, but West Virginia's modern history. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, Chris, thanks for having me. And Betty's is a legacy that will live on in West Virginia, that's for sure.
Andrew Spellman is back this week for another one of his great outdoor features. This time, another look at a local fisherman who's found success online. Speaking of the great outdoors, nature enthusiasts across the nation have something to celebrate this week as the Senate passed the Great American Outdoors Act, which will now move to the House of Representatives for a final vote. I'm joined now by Dominion Post sports and outdoors reporter Andrew Spellman. Andrew, you have been covering quite a few outdoors folk, outdoorsmen, while we've been in quarantine in particular. You've really stepped it up. So what was it in particular about Tyler Brill that attracted you to seek him out for a story?
I've been watching him for about a year now on YouTube and really liked his videos. And one day I was watching, I think, a video from like 6 months ago that I maybe had missed and noticed that something looked really familiar in the video. He was fishing under a bridge, and I said, man, that bridge looks like it's in Hedgesville. And, I was working in the Eastern Panhandle last year at a newspaper and did a little bit of searching and found out that my guess was correct, and then did a little more digging and found out he was actually a West Virginian. I, found him on Instagram and shot him a message, and he was interested in talking to me. So as easy as that.
So for those of our listeners that aren't familiar and haven't read your story yet, what is Tyler and his channel all about?
So Tyler's channel is basically it's all fishing. He does a lot of trout fishing with spinning reels and spinning bait, which I think is fascinating because it's uncommon, and you think of trout fishing, you think of fly fishing. And he does some other stuff. He does a lot of creek fishing, and, that's kind of like what we all have around here. The easiest stuff to access are the creeks around, our towns. So that's what his channel's all about.
So in your story, you mentioned, and you've mentioned this in other stories, Tyler has managed to turn a small profit off of his YouTube videos. And we've also seen this with your own coverage. Your stories tend to be very popular on our website. Andrew, what is it about watching people go outside and do things outside, especially in a community like ours where there's no lack of access to the outdoors, Why are people attracted to sitting in their homes and watching these videos instead of going out and doing it themselves?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. I'll start with people who don't have access to outdoors like you and I do here in Morgantown, or just people in West Virginia in general. I think they long for access, especially now when they're cooped up inside because of COVID. So I think that's part of it. Another part of it is, I like to go fishing all the time, and I live right next to Cheat Lakes. And sometimes, even though I'm working from home, I can't go down for a certain amount of days. So I like watching videos, in my spare time to maybe pick up a few tips here and there, but also just to be like, man, I can't wait till I get back out on Cheat Lake again. And then I think another part of it is like the phenomenon we've seen where people love watching streamers like play video games, right? Where they could easily just go play the video game themselves, but they know they're not going to, and they maybe just don't want to. So I think that's part of it too, So there's probably more reasons, but I would say those are three of the big ones that I can think of.
Shifting topics here only slightly on you, Andrew, you have also been reporting, as well as our colleague David Beard, State House reporter for the Dominion Post, about this Great American Outdoors Act sponsored by our own Senator Manchin. For our listeners, can you explain to us what exactly that bill is?
So the Great American Outdoors Act will provide $900 million annually to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was created in 1965 to use offshore drilling and gas money to go back towards our public lands and waters. And it's only been fully funded twice in the history of its being. From 1965, it's only been fully funded twice. And the other money, as Senator Manchin likes to say, has gone into a black hole. $22 billion has gone into a black hole in the Treasury that will never be used towards public lands and waters. The bill will also provide annually $1.9 billion. So over the next 5 years, it will be $9.5 billion to federal agencies and programs to begin work on, I believe it's $20 billion worth of deferred maintenance. I can't remember the exact number on that, but there's a lot of deferred maintenance that needs to happen on national parks, national park sites, monuments, you name it.
What do you mean, Andrew, when you say deferred maintenance? What does that mean?
So deferred maintenance, I'll use Harper's Ferry as an example. There's buildings that are crumbling. These are buildings that go back to the founding of Harper's Ferry. They're crumbling. So the money will go into restoring those. And another thing that a lot of West Virginians, I'm sure, can relate to are potholes in these old cobblestone roads, or just roads in general at these national park sites. So it will go towards projects like that. Another thing, I don't know if this will go towards it. I imagine it would. From that train wreck that happened just past Harper's Ferry this past year, the bridge was damaged. So it'll go towards that as well. So there's so many more projects. That's just like a quick example that I could give people that they might be able to pull up in their minds if they've been to Harper's Ferry. And
so, Andrew, what will this new funding mean practically on the ground for outdoors folk like yourself and Tyler and the other people that you've profiled in your series?
Well, it's not just for outdoors folk. It's for people that just like hiking or biking or backpacking. It will provide for generations and generations of Americans to access these lands that are ours. The North American model of conservation states that you and I own the public lands along with every other citizen and visitor to this country. We own these lands, so it will provide for generations, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and their grandchildren. Hopefully, as long as the government doesn't retract this at some point, but it'll basically provide access to these lands, and not just access, but it will provide wonderful facilities that aren't crumbling, bathrooms that aren't overflowing, trash bins that aren't overflowing. So it's also going to create jobs. Senator Manchin has but he's pulled up the number, 140,000 jobs are likely to be created from this. He harkens back to FDR's New Deal when all those work programs were instated. So it has so many implications for the greater picture that will benefit not just our generation and our parents and our grandparents, but our grandkids and their grandkids, as long as the government upholds its side of the bargain.
All right, well, Andrew, as always, I want to thank you for bringing a piece of the outdoors into our homes and also for being on the show today and explaining this to us. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
As I said last week, the Dominion Post is committed to bringing you the voices of local protests directly as long as they continue. After Thursday's action on the steps of the Morgantown Public Safety Building, I had a chance to catch up with local organizer Sam Norris.
So Sam, I just am curious to know, there was a lower turnout today than we've seen in previous days. How does that make you feel?
That doesn't bother me at all, actually. We're going into 3 weeks of this happening at this point. Just the fact that anyone's willing to come out is incredible. And when you have these smaller turnouts, you actually get more conversations done. Large protests, while being great, aren't what really makes the change. What makes the change is people being willing to grow, to have these conversations, to show that we're still out here, we're still active. And that's what this is, All week we're gonna have some sort of protest. We're having this today, the Juneteenth cookout both tomorrow and Saturday, and then the Westover sit-in. And every single person that comes is trying to make a difference. And in a small town like this, small turnouts are still turnouts, If we were in Pittsburgh and only 5 people showed up, I would have been mad. But we're in a town of 30,000 people on a Thursday where people are working, they're tired, they don't have time to come out for this, and I understand that. So the people that did come out and make a difference, that's important.
You mentioned there tomorrow is Juneteenth. When
Yes.
people will be listening to this, today is Juneteenth. What is Juneteenth?
So Juneteenth marks the anniversary of when the final slaves were freed from Texas following the Civil War. It's like Black Liberation Day for Americans, It's when our chains were finally broken from slavery, when we were able to start making progress, start making change in society and making our lives, the Black community's life, better. And it's not just a celebration for Black people, it's a celebration for everyone that's anti-racist, for everyone that thought slavery was wrong, for everyone that's working towards freedom, that's working towards equality, That's why everyone's welcome at the Juneteenth cookout. Everyone can come to the cookout. It doesn't matter your color, because it's about all of us. That's also why we want so badly for Juneteenth to become a national holiday, We celebrate July 4th. We should also celebrate the Independence Day for our Black community as well.
A lot of the conversation today revolved around income inequality
Yes.
and classism, which obviously have been touched upon at previous actions, but why was there such a focus on that today?
So I've been seeing a lot of people say, I can't have privilege because I'm poor, which just isn't true. As a fellow poor individual, you can have privilege within these wealth systems. But when it comes down to it, wealth inequality is the greatest threat that we all face. The people at the top, the people that own all of these means of production, the people that are hiring us while refusing to give us health care and living wages and decent hours, they're making billions of dollars off of our labor while we're all struggling. And at least the people at the bottom fighting within each other. Because we'll see other people and we're like, they don't understand what it's like to be poor. They don't understand what it's like to struggle. They don't understand what it's like to not be able to afford health care. When we all understand that. We all get it. A lot of times, the racism that we see comes from this perceived class difference that we just don't have, Like, a lot of times we'll see people and we'll be like, oh, they don't understand what it's like to be poor, so obviously I'm not going to be in support of their cause. It's important that people know that we all understand that. we can't fight racism and live in a system that's this classist, because it's just going to bring it back around. When we're fighting against inequalities, we're fighting against all inequalities, you know? Until the day that everyone can afford healthcare, everyone can afford food, everyone can afford housing, everyone can walk down the streets and feel like a safe human, we can't stop. And classism specifically is so important in the Black community because the Black community on average is poorer than the white community. You know, we see that wealth inequality so deeply. So when other people that don't quite get it yet, when we're having these discussions that are further than race, that are like, look at these furthering inequalities that's leading to these problems, it brings us together. It creates a more united front so that we can actually change things. We don't need to be fighting between ourselves when we're all at the bottom. We need to work together, tear it down so we're all at the same level.
You also talked about self-care and the importance of, for lack of a better term, self-maintenance.
Yes. When you're doing activism, when you're having these hard conversations with your family and online, when you're struggling for your equality, for your freedom, you get burnt out. You just do. And if you're burnt out, you can't continue the movement. A candle with no flame can't light the way. You need to take the time to replenish your candle. You know, you can't pour from an empty cup. If you're tired, if you're worn out, if your body's hurting, if your heart's hurting, you're not going to have the strength to move forward. That's just how it is. And this is coming from me. I'm disabled, you know. Every day I struggle with my body, and I realized that when I wasn't taking care of myself, I wasn't able to put my full self into this movement. Mm-hmm. When I took the time back to be like, I have to get off of Facebook, have to get off Twitter, have to unplug and focus on my mental health, focus on my physical health, focus on my emotional health, I wasn't able to do anything. You have to take care of yourself. If you're not taking care of yourself, you can't change the world. It's like if you're marching. If you're not hydrated and fed, you can't march for 5 miles, you know?
Yeah.
If you're not, self-care is so important, especially in a society that tells us it's selfish to put ourselves first. It's not selfish to take care of your health and to take care of your well-being and take care of your mental health. Mental health is so important. We have a mental health crisis in this nation right now, you know? Suicide and drug overdoses are the number one killer of people ages 20 to 40. If we're not taking care of our mental health, we're not going to get anything accomplished, and we're going to stay at the bottom. It can be hard to take that step back, take those breaths, and relax before getting out of it. You might feel guilty. I know I feel guilty when I'm taking a day off to focus on myself, but we can't. We just can't feel guilty about that. We need time to rejuvenate ourselves before we continue changing. It doesn't mean the fight's ended because we took a day off. It just means that we're going to come back better and more powerful the next day.
Marcus and you both made allusions to what many are calling lynchings that have been occurring across the country. For the people that are uninformed about that specific issue, what exactly was it that you were referring to?
So, as of the last time I checked the news, there were 6 lynchings. And they're being ruled as suicides, but we're calling them lynchings for a specific reason. There are young black men, and in one case it was a young black female that was pregnant, being hung from trees in prominent areas of towns where these protests are happening. And they're being ruled suicides, but as someone who has had to be in the mental hospital for suicide ideology, you don't want to kill yourself in public. You're not about that life, you know? These are scare tactics. They're terrorist attacks. We're calling them lynchings because lynchings in the early 1900s were used as a way to terrorize black communities and keep them silent. And when it starts happening again in response to these Black Lives Matter protests, they're clearly lynchings. They're clearly terrorist attacks. They're a way to try to terrify and keep the black community and the supporters of Black Lives Matter, not just the black community, scared. And unfortunately, it's working. I've had people come up to me and be like, I can't come to these protests anymore because I'm scared I'll get hurt. And that's letting them win. Our lynching laws, specifically in West Virginia, are pretty antiquated too. They were developed in the late 1920s. Right now, the only way for something to be considered a lynching is if it was a public spectacle based off of a perceived crime with 5 or more individuals doing it. But that's not how modern lynchings occur. Modern lynchings usually occur in the dead of night. You wake up and then there's a black man hanging in your tree. Under the current laws, that wouldn't be considered a lynching. It'd just be considered a homicide. We really need to change that. If we see someone being hung by a tree in public, number one, it needs to be investigated as a homicide right off of the bat. You need to assume that there's foul play involved instead of assuming that it's a suicide. Because people don't want to kill themselves in public like that. And the fact that it's only happening with people of color, with Black, Indigenous people of color, it's a clear sign that it's being used to scare our community, you know? These white supremacist groups are bringing back this awful, terroristic action to scare us. That's why we're calling them lynchings, because that's what it is. When 6 people across the country, 2 in the same city, are being killed in very similar ways, you have to call a spade a spade.
I want to ask you about the repeated call for inclusion in the local movement. You yourself have talked repeatedly about the necessity to include queer people, disabled people, and people of all creeds and races in this movement. It's not just for Black people. Why is that so important for you?
Well, one, I'm a queer, disabled woman of color. And I'm biracial. You know, I have a white mom, I have a Black dad. Just because you see me on the street and you see me as Black, it doesn't change the fact that I'm still half white. Inside of me, I have all of these different marginalized groups coming together. Because I have that identity, it pushes me forward to fight for everyone else. We're all seen as a different version of other. We're all seen as outliers. When we come together, when we work together, when we uplift our brothers and sisters, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of whether they're able-bodied or not, we become stronger as a whole. You know? We can't be a movement about equality if our queer neighbors aren't equal, if our disabled neighbors aren't equal, if our Muslim, our Hispanic, our Latino neighbors aren't equal, if the homeless population isn't seen as equal, because that's not equality. I don't want to be at the top and look down and see other people. I want to be at the top and look around and see everyone else too. We're a community. I want the community to grow better together. I don't want anyone left behind.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say? Anything that you think I missed?
People should definitely check out Juneteenth. It's going on Friday and Saturday. If you're interested in the movement and in a peaceful protest and hearing from a lot more people than just me, come out to the sit-in on Sunday too. We always let everyone have a voice. It's so important to me that everyone get their moment in the spotlight to share their story. We all have that voice. We all have that power.
Thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
That's all for this week's episode. The links to all the stories we discuss are also in the description of this episode on your podcasting app. If you haven't already, subscribe to make sure you don't miss a single episode. We would also really appreciate it if you would take the time to rate and review us. Nobody's exactly sure why, but a rate and a review combo really goes a long way to boost the show. Be sure to check out our sports podcast, Best of 7. Andrew and Sean are now putting out new episodes every week. You can also check out our local history podcast, All About History, an all-new episode all about the 1918 influenza pandemic and its impact on Morgantown and the surrounding areas, is live now. We want to hear from you. Do you like the show? Do you hate the sound of my voice? Is it too loud? Is it too quiet? Let me know. Email podcast@dominionpost.com, or you can reach out on any of the Dominion Post social media. We're Dominion Post, WV, on Twitter, Dominion Post _WV on Instagram, or go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/Dominion Post WV. Tweet directly at me if you like. I'm at Schultz Reports on Twitter. That's SCHULZ. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you back here next week. Wash them hands.